All right, everybody. So I'm going to review assignment 6 now. It's probably going to be a longer video, so I apologize for that. But I want to take you step by step through those different quotes to get a sense as to how white slave owners justified slavery at the time. I'm sorry I put a lot. I kind of got a little out of control there. But there were kind of like three different themes in terms of how they justified it: racially, religiously, and economically. So I want to show you my work. I'm going to do it through like a share screen, so you're going to see it switch in a second, and then I'll kind of take you down one by one on each quote. So let's give it a shot. I think it's this. Well, actually, I think it's this one. Let's share this one, and then we're going to go to my assignment 6. Give it a second to load. Uh-oh. Hold on. There we go. All right. So hopefully this works. But all right, first quote. I already gave you the first one, so let's look at the second one by William Harper. So it says, William Harper says, quote, "The first and most obvious effect of banning slavery would be to put an end to the cultivation of our great southern staple cotton. The cultivation of the great staple crops cannot be carried on in any portion of our own country where there are not slaves. Even if it were possible to procure laborers at all, what planter would venture to carry on his operations? Imagine an extensive rice or cotton plantation cultivated by free laborers who might perhaps strike for an increase of wages." I had this as an economic justification of slavery, and I said William Harper is arguing that if slavery is banned, let me fix that now. If slavery is banned, there is no way that the Southern economy can survive, especially the cotton industry. He also says if you were to replace slaves with paid labor, there was no way to make it work financially. Plantations would go broke without slaves. So connected to like the mill girls, he basically said if there's no slaves, no way would we get the cotton to be produced. People would go on strike. So that's that one. Moving on to the quote by Bishop Stephen Eliot. I'm not going to read the whole quote. I realize that's too long. But I had this one as a racial and religious argument. And I said, Bishop Eliot states that there have been efforts to civilize Native Americans. We looked at it in the Manifest Destiny unit. But there has been a greater number of Africans that were successfully civilized because of slavery. He says, slavery has, in fact, according to Bishop Eliot, saved Africans from themselves and made them more controlled and stronger. Slavery has been a means for white men to save Africans by exposing them to Christianity. So part of what they were saying is slavery is actually good for Africans. It teaches them how to be quote unquote civilized, and Christianity saves them from their evilness, their sin, which is just but again, this was to try and kind of brainwash white slave owners in the sense of that slavery is okay. It's ridiculous. So the next one by, I think it's Solon Robinson, I had as an economic reason, and I said, Mr. Robinson says, typos, that slavery is not actually that bad. He claims that slaves have a better life than poor freemen. He says, if you go out into Europe and you try to look at freemen, you will see that everyone's poor, not well fed, and they're struggling to even put clothes on their back. So he's actually saying that slaves are in a better state than poor freemen, so we should keep slaves because we're actually making them better than poor people. A little twisted way of kind of justifying it. James Hammond has an economic argument, according to what I thought. I said James Hammond brings up a strong economic argument here. He argues that if there is not a big cotton production, then the British economy will topple. And like we have studied before, the only way to meet the demands of the cotton industry is from slave labor. So if slavery is slavery is justified because the British Empire needs it in order to thrive economically. The British Empire needed cotton, and in order to get cotton, you need slave labor. So he said, basically, economically, it's justified because everybody needs cotton in order to thrive economically, and in order to get cotton, you need slaves. Therefore, slavery is justified. Moving on, John C. Calhoun, who's actually, we'll hear more from him this unit. He's a senator from South Carolina, really prominent and like famous at the time. He argues an extremely racial argument about slavery. He argues that the institution of slavery has civilized Africans physically, morally, and intellectually. Physically has developed them the best, has taught them what is right and wrong, and has made them smarter, is what John C. Calhoun says, which is super similar to kind of the Bishop Eliot argument up here. And we'll kind of see that thread come back up in a little bit. But he says, but going back to John C. Calhoun, he says slavery, according to Calhoun, is justified because it has saved and civilized the inferior African people. Connected to that, Michael Renwick Sargent also makes a racial argument. He says that civilizations in Africa were unruly and tyrannical and abusive, and that slavery has actually exposed Africans to a civilized way of living. And therefore, it's a racial argument because he's implying, just like, remember when we did like, he's really saying thing? So he's really saying, by saying that white slave owners have exposed Africans to a civilized way of living, he's implying that they have an uncivilized way of living in Africa, therefore inferior, unruly. Another racial argument. Thomas Jefferson, the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, our third president, I think our first Secretary of State, our second vice president, all these things. We know Thomas Jefferson. He was one of the huge founding fathers, has a very racial justification of slavery. He says, his quote's powerful, so I'm going to read that one, but he says, I advance it therefore as a suspicion only. He does say a suspicion, but his affirmative statement is kind of messed up. He goes, that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both body and mind. It is not against experience to suppose that different species of the same genus or varieties of the same species may possess different qualifications. So he does kind of say maybe it's circumstance that has created this inferiority between whites and blacks, but essentially he's saying that Africans are inferior to white people, and then therefore slavery is justified because of that inferiority that exists. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, moving on here, he says he has a racial and religious argument. He says that we learn to keep Africans in a place of slavery from the Bible. So this was another key thing. I tried to find a good quote that captures this, but a lot of white slave owners really learned the idea of slavery through the Bible. The Bible talks about slavery, so they've used it as a justification, saying it's just part of Christianity. God has blessed the institution of slavery. Typically, it was slavery as a form of punishment in the Bible, and white slave owners turned it into this racial argument. But Samuel Cartwright says, if white people keep Africans in a state of slavery, they will not be wild and out of control. They'll be tamed and actually saved from their natural, quote, wild side, which is another messed up way of thinking. And then finally here, Josiah Nott, who we looked at when we looked at the justifications of westward expansion, he had a racial argument then. Sure enough, he has a racial argument about slavery as well. He, like Thomas Jefferson, argues that Africans are physically, intellectually, and morally inferior to white people, and therefore it is natural and justified to enslave them. So these white slave owners were using all of those reasons to kind of basically say slavery is okay. And they started with economics, and they said, look, we get it. Slavery. It started pretty like at the time of the founding of the United States. It started purely economics. We have to, you know, it's a necessary evil, is what they said. We have to keep slavery in order to thrive economically. It's just something we're stuck with. Some even blamed it on Britain, saying that it's Britain's fault for creating the Americas with the institution of slavery because now we're stuck in it. But then as things started to develop more, and in the North you had factories, the justification for slavery became like harder to make. All right, economically we've proven that we can make a lot of things through factories, so how do you still justify slavery? Then white slave owners basically said, oh, well, there's these religious reasons to do it. Oh, and there's these racial reasons to do it. And they kind of kept building these arguments up to try and justify their want for dominance and superiority. And what you'll see in assignments 7, which is probably below this video, you start to see how there's these physical pain inflicted on enslaved people and a psychological pain in which these slave owners start to craft these racial ideas that they had of inferiority, and they try to bestow it and like put it into effect on enslaved Africans. And it's created this, that really rooted this system of slavery deeply into the fabric of the United States. And you'll see in the videos kind of all of the lasting tension that we're experiencing in the United States. The racial tension is so much deeply tied to the effects of slavery. And this way of thinking, it set up these racist thoughts in the United States this time period. So hopefully that helps with assignment 6. Again, go back if you need to pause to see each one. By all means, go for it. I know by the time of this video, not many folks have completed assignment 6, but thank you for getting here. And again, hope you're doing well. Stay good.